I was interested to read your analysis in the Australian today. You've said that the day was always going to come where a US president has said to Europe they need to do more in their own defence. And as you put it today, that day has come. What do you make of the response from Europe?
Well, I think the Europeans are a little bit shocked that this day has come, but they have been depending since the end of the Cold War on the United States providing the defense of Western Europe. And in the early years, that was perhaps understandable. But since the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union, Europe should have been making more of a contribution to its own defense and hasn't been. It's just been depending ultimately on American taxpayers for their defense. So the Europeans have been spending money on a whole raft of things, welfare programs, building windmills and all that kind of thing, while the Americans have covered for their defense. And not surprisingly, the Americans, I mean, whether it's President Trump or anyone else, the Americans have reached the point where they're saying the Europeans should be able to handle Russia because the EU economy is 10 or 15 times the size of Russia's. So they have the potential to deal with Russia without the Americans being centrally involved.
Indeed, there's that size question, but then you've got the intent. Is there the intent to do that? The British and the French have responded forcefully, others less so, particularly when it comes to the idea of peacekeepers.
Well, that's right, and this is the problem with Europe. I mean, they don't sing with one voice; they have many voices, and the European Union plus the UK shouldn't be seen as a behemoth. I mean, it's a diversity of countries with a diversity of politics and a diversity of views, and you're seeing that on that issue. But the British and the French have always been more forward-leaning on defence issues. And they're quite right to say that they would make a contribution or set up a peacekeeping force in Ukraine to police the ceasefire if a ceasefire ever comes. And the Americans, sure, they would provide that with backup if the worst came to the worst. But this is something the Europeans should be able to handle themselves in the main. I mean, after all, Russia isn't a threat to the United States, and it's not a serious threat to Western Europe either. The Russians have nothing like the capacity to invade Germany or Austria or, sweep through to Italy and France. They have no capacity to do that. They haven't even been able to knock over Ukraine. They've been trying for 11 years, actually, not just 3 years. So, and the Americans are right about this, and I think it's a warning to Australia that we need to make a serious contribution to our own defence as well, not just depend on the Americans.
Oh, I do want to ask you about that and get you to elaborate on that specifically in a moment, but just on the Americans before we move on from their worldview and strategic approach under Donald Trump. I'm interested to hear what you think on this. Is this an example of Trump moving behind the frontier America sort of worldview? Will he leave China to its own devices in our part of the world, say with Taiwan and so on?
No, I mean, I think this, if you like, I'm not accusing you of this, by the way, but this anti-Trump narrative that somehow he's an isolationist and he's just going to withdraw behind America's borders is completely wrong. I mean, it didn't happen during his first term and it won't happen during this term. It's just that when it comes to Ukraine, he thinks that Europe should have the capacity predominantly, not exclusively, to deal with that issue. But the United States has to turn its mind to making sure there is effective deterrence against a resurgent China, and there are problems to sort out in the Middle East. That's the priority. And Europe can't deal with China. It can help, of course, but it can't deal with China. America has to do that with its Asia-Pacific allies. And so that is the way the administration thinks. It's not thinking of isolationism, by the way. That isn't the plan.
And when you look to Australia's approach and what we're doing, you said it's a wake-up call. Can you elaborate on that for us? Where do we need to position ourselves right now amid an uncertain future?
Well, the Americans would have metaphorically raised an eyebrow when they saw the way we handled that Chinese fleet circumnavigating Australia. I mean, any country with a serious defence force would have monitored that the whole way, would have known all about its activities. I mean, these games go on. You see them in other parts of the world the whole time. They are a test of the capability of a defence force. So, in a sense, we did quite poorly in that test. And that will remind the Americans, and it should certainly remind us, that we have to invest more in effective defence capability than we've been doing in recent years. I mean, in recent years, we've been squabbling about submarines, but we haven't got any new submarines. We're pouring huge amounts of money into the AUKUS program without any idea where that money is going to come from. We're not building sufficient advanced defence capability very quickly, which is what we need to do.
Australia's longest serving Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, appreciate your time. Thank you for your insights.